You go closer. So Michael, do you want to take it from here?
Oh, is it me? Sorry. Okay, yeah. Okay, sure, yeah. Hi. So, thank you so much for having me here over Skype. In contrast to Emma and Mariana, I'm not an early modernist, but in many ways worse, because I'm not an urban historian at all, really. Certainly not by birth or training. So I came to this project and my interest in urban history more broadly by accident, really. I was originally a historian of Latin America by training. My first book was about nationalism in 20th century Argentina. So that was an intellectual and political history really that had nothing to do at all with cities. In fact, the discourse that I looked at was, as so many nationalist discourses, much more ruralist than urbanist. So it was about people who evoked gaucho figures and rural imagery, although sometimes in contradistinction to the big city imagined as this, imperialist bridgehead of foreign elitist penetration of the country. So urban things played a role in the background, but I wasn't particularly interested in them, at least of all in actual urban space itself. Now, with my interest in nationalism, or in nationalism in Latin America or Argentina in particular, at some point in Paris as a place for Latin American intellectual exchange. So I started to look more at Paris as a place where Latin American intellectuals from different countries met, and became interested in that again without a lot of interest in urban space. Now, that book became much more a book about anti-colonial activists from the French Empire in interwar Paris. It was originally a history, again, more of ideas than a social history, but increasingly people pushed me to look at how urban space mattered, in particular for how certain people met other people or did not. So how urban circuits and uses of urban space by those activists mattered for their politics eventually. But I had to be pushed hard to develop an interest in that. I didn't develop it myself. It was usually at conferences that people asked me, well, can you tell us a bit more where those activists met and so forth? And I thought, well, why would I? What's the information there? So it took a long time till all this urban history interest developed more strongly in me. And if anything, I came more from the global history side of things to this whole mélange of global and urban history, if you like. Even though there again, in the first place, I was a national historian of Argentina rather than anything else. But being in Europe, I was eventually forced to, or felt compelled to form part of this broad church that developed and called itself global history, in part because the funding is there, in part because there's very few jobs in Latin American history in Europe, so you become a global historian by default once you deal with non-European world regions in many ways in Europe. In fact, I met a Brazilian historian a few years ago who was in Berlin for a year, who worked about manumission in the southern Brazilian city of Florianopolis. That was his project in the 19th century, and he came here and told me. So all my life I thought I was a regional historian of southern Brazil. Once I came to Berlin, I realized no, I'm in fact a global historian, simply because he was labeled as such. Once he came here, so. Global history means different things for different people, also partly different things in the United States and here. I think here the understanding is slightly more dogmatic than over there. But over time I was drawn into this field of global history, and by default had developed this interest in the city of Paris in this case. And all of this morphed into a broader interest in the history of immigration in cities, which was part of this Paris book. And developed eventually into a future, still pretty vague project that has to do with ethnic segregation in late 19th century port cities. And there, obviously, you have the classic and starkest combination of the local urban social fabric in a particular place with global connections, in particular in the form of trade and migration. So that's how I became interested in connecting global and urban history, and this is how this blog that Carl and Emma mentioned came into being, called Global Urban History, and this is intended to bring together urban historians and people who think of themselves as belonging to global history. But again, in part, this came out of a response to a criticism that was made of global history, or is being made of global history, which was my frame of reference mostly, and that was that global history is aloof. It doesn't have enough attention to the specifics of place. It deals with all those macro processes and so forth, and we need, in contrast, more empirical studies of concrete places and also of people and places that do not necessarily move. And there I thought that in many ways urban history provides an interesting antidote to those criticisms leveled at global history, because one of its virtues obviously is microscopic attention to specific places. And cities are particularly suited, of course, because they're also usually the hubs leading to globalizing processes. And so this global urban history blog was intended to look at the intersection of those two fields, so in particular at cities, but usually with a global conceptual horizon or some sort of global history argument tied to this. Now, what have I learned during my time editing this blog and being part of the Global Urban History project, which we are discussing here? Now, first of all, I suspected this, but I have learned even more forcefully, I think, in some ways, that global history and urban history are not functional equivalents. They developed out of sync. As you all know, global history, particularly the label, is of much more recent vintage, whereas urban history is an older, venerable, although also smaller field that came largely out of 1960s social history and has some of its birthmarks attached to that history, which makes communication with people who identify with global history sometimes harder, I think, than it should be. Also, as I said earlier, global history has become this huge, broad church, in particular in Germany, where all the funding is, so that everybody wants to flock into that field. And as a result of all that, I have found it much easier to persuade urban historians to think about the global label than I have found it to attract global historians to the history of cities. In particular, because I often can't quite see why they should have this particular topical interest. So for the future, I think, and this sounds perhaps a bit more pessimistic, but I would like to see and generate more interest for urban history among people who think of themselves as global historians, and that is sometimes something that I think is pretty difficult. Also, in some ways, because it is harder, I think, to become an urban historian than it is to call yourself a global historian. As I have learned myself, it's a specific field with certain codes and with a long trajectory of training in specific methods and so forth, much more so, I think, than global history is. So in general, with GUHP, I would like to try to make this more attractive also to people who do not necessarily think of themselves primarily as urban historians. And finally, what I have learned is that language matters. It's noticeable for the blog, so we're always torn between this desire to broaden our geographical scope in terms of where the scholars who participate in this or contribute to our blog are based, but but there's of course acute linguistic barriers to expanding this everywhere, and we can see this from our statistics where the blog is read, and this at the moment is mostly in Europe and the United States. So it would be great to broaden this to make it also more global in scope in terms of where the scholars who contribute to this project are from. But there's also problems to that, as I mentioned. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.